Right. Hi, everyone. We welcome you all to this brand new interview on doing sociology. And we're extremely glad to have with us today Professor Patrick Heller. And we would be talking to him about some of his important writings. Before we begin with the interview, I'll tell you a little bit about Professor Heller. He is the Lynn Crost Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology and International Studies in Brown University. He is the director of the Development Research Program at the Watson Institute of International Studies and Public Affairs. His main area of research is the comparative study of social inequality and democratic deepening. He's the author of The Labor of Development, Workers in the Transformation of Capitalism in Kerala, and is the co-author of Social Democracy and the Global Periphery. Is authored Bootstrapping Democracy, Transforming Local Governance and Civil Society in Brazil. And very recently, Deliberation and Development, Rethinking the Role of Voice and Collective Action in Unequal Societies. He's published articles on urbanization, comparative democracy, social movements, development policy, civil society, and state transformation. And his most recent project, Cities of Delhi, conducted in collaboration with the Center for Policy Research, explores the dynamics of governance and social exclusion in India's capital. Welcome, sir. We're extremely glad to have you with us today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, my first question to you is that what role does the middle class play in the rise of populist governments? And could you talk about this from your recent paper, which you wrote on Brazil and India's populist regimes?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you've started with this middle class question because it's very topical. Across the world, we've experienced a lot of democratic backsliding, and much of the commentary has focused on European countries and the United States with the rise of Trump. And much of the focus of the debate has been on the disaffected working class. And so the argument very broadly is because of globalization, because of deindustrialization, because of neoliberal policies, the working class has suffered economically, and right-wing populists have exploited their plight by pushing ideas of exclusion and racism and anti-immigrant sentiment to mobilize support for right-wing causes. And so there's now this association with the disaffected working class with the rise of these populist regimes. But what's striking in this narrative about what Western democracies is that the story just doesn't fit the patterns of reaction that we're seeing in India and Brazil, to take the two best known cases of democratic backsliding. So in both India and Brazil, populist right-wing governments have come to power, and they do have a resemblance, at least in style and in their politics, to the right-wing populism that one sees in Western Europe and the United States, but there are significant differences. So what's similar, of course, is they're all right-wing forms of populism. That is, they're playing on the cultural politics of asserting a dominant national identity, Hindutva in India, the rise of white nationalism in the United States, Brexit in England, anti-immigrant sentiment on the European continent. So it's a politics of cultural exclusion that reaffirms an essentialized identity. And they're all similar in that respect. The difference I've maintained is the class base of populism. The class base of populism in India and in Brazil it has a lot less to do with the working class and a lot more to do with the middle class. And this is interesting in a number of respects. First of all, in terms of the larger debates on democracy, the classic literature in sociology in particular has always argued that the middle class is very good for democracy. So all the great modernization arguments basically made the claim that as capitalist economies develop and become more sophisticated, they produce an educated middle class, and educated middle classes, appreciate the freedoms and the liberties and the protection of property and accountability that comes with democracy. Yet we've learned over time that the middle class's support for democracy is actually quite fickle. So while it is certainly true that in many democracies, especially in new post-colonial democracies, the middle classes, the professional classes, the English-speaking, more educated, urbanized classes did support democracy, they only support it as long as it really serves their interests. And when they feel threatened from below, they have a tendency to flip, as it were, and to support regimes that are more autocratic or less committed to democratic principles. And what's really striking in drawing this comparison between Brazil and India is that if you look at the electoral realignments, the electoral shifts that brought Bolsonaro to power and that brought the BJP and Modi to power, it's a very similar realignment. So previous to Bolsonaro's presidential victory 4 years ago, the PT, the Workers' Party, had been in power in Brazil for 4 consecutive terms. And this was a party that, as its name suggests, the Workers' Party had its roots in the Brazilian working class, but it did have a lot of support from the middle class, especially professionals, academics, intellectuals. The public health community was a big part of the support for the PT. And a lot of that middle class defected and voted for Bolsonaro. And similarly, in India, historically, the middle class was associated with the Congress and the Nehruvian vision of democracy. And over the past 2-3 decades, and Leila Fernandez, of course, has done a lot of work on this, it's shifted its allegiances slowly but surely from the secular and democratic principles of the Congress Party to the Hindutva and the populism of the BJP. And so it's quite striking that in both these cases of democratic backsliding and the rise of autocratic regimes or regimes that have very authoritarian tendency, the key social base has been the middle class. Now, of course, to win elections in India, like in Brazil, you have to make appeals to other classes. And so, of course, there's segments of the Dalit community in India that have also supported the BJP. And there are many segments of the Brazilian working class that supported the PT that have defected and now support the Bolsonaro's politics. But fundamentally, the core social class that brought these two regimes to power is the middle class. And that then sort of begs the question, why is the middle class supporting these regimes? And I think largely it has to do with what in the Indian context has been called the second democratic upsurge. And this is Yogendra Yadav and others, describing the rise of lower castes and the OBC community in the beginning of the 70s, but really consolidating in the 80s and the 90s. This was a real threat to, as it were, a middle class hegemony, right? The middle class in India dominates all the institutions, educational, government, political parties, et cetera. And with the rise of the lower castes and the lower classes, their hegemony begins to be threatened and their ability to monopolize institutions. I think in particular education, which is obviously the key asset in the new information-based global economy, as they felt increasingly threatened with reservations, with just the rise of these lower classes. They've been willing to support causes that might reassert middle class control over institutions. And we see exactly the same thing in Brazil. During the PT years, it's the working classes who saw their incomes increase. There was increasing formalization of labor markets. All of a sudden, domestic servants had labor contracts and could negotiate with their middle class employers. And eventually, especially as the economy started slowing down, the middle class felt increasingly threatened and defected. And, I would add, of course, that we're not just talking about a class here. Middle class in India or obviously correlates with caste, upper castes, who might feel threatened by the assertion of lower caste. And in Brazil, middle class correlates with being white in a country that's a majority non-white. And with the PT, the PT regimes, they felt increasingly threatened by, blacks and affirmative action policies that brought blacks into their neighborhoods, that brought blacks into their educational institutions. And so in a sense, this is really a politics of reaction that's being driven primarily, not exclusively, but primarily by the middle class.
Right. So you talk about the new middle class in Brazil and India, and one of your co-authored pieces with Professor Leila Fernandez, both of you look at how the middle class contributes to developing this, hegemony in terms of democratic politics. I would also want to know, since you mentioned that education is one of the ways in which this hegemony is maintained, are there any other ways, through which the middle class sort of does this? And also, if you could point out, in case there are any differences between the middle class in India and Brazil.
Yeah, that's a great set of questions. So, yeah, the piece that I did with Leila Fernandez some years back. So first of all, I should say something about the term hegemony, because people throw it around, and it's just become a way of talking about being dominant without being very clear what the difference is between domination and hegemony. And the term hegemony, of course, comes from Gramsci's work and has been picked up by the subaltern theorists. And the key to hegemony is exerting class domination by eliciting consent. So there's still coercion, there's still power in the traditional sense of the term, of having the power of the state to impose a class's interests. But hegemony implies that this class has been able to elicit consent by making the case that what's in the interest of that class is in the interests of all classes. A class becomes hegemonic not when it says, we're different and we're separate and we're powerful. A class becomes hegemonic when it says what's good for us is good for everyone. And that work of hegemony, of producing hegemony, is ideological work, essentially. And Gramsci went on to argue that a truly hegemonic regime is a regime that not only uses the powers of the state, but also uses the institutions of civil society, the media, educational institutions that are outside of the direct control of the state, the church, associations, et cetera, to do this work of eliciting consent. So just to be clear on that. And, the middle class, he developed a theory to talk about the bourgeoisie in the traditional Marxist sense of the term, the owners of the means of production. And, they make the case that what's good for capital is good for labor. And that's the context in which we're mostly familiar with debates about hegemony. But, the capitalist economy is a very different economy today from what it was almost 100 years ago when Gramsci was writing about hegemony. And increasingly, obviously, capital still matters. But most of the value generation in modern capitalist economies is really happening in the sphere of information, the mobilization of technologies, especially obviously IT now. And it's more and more based on educational capital. So in the piece that you referred to that Leila and I wrote now quite some time ago on the, quote, new middle class, we drew on Gramsci, but we also drew on Bourdieu, because Bourdieu is the sociologist, of course, that took the idea of economic capital, which is the scarce resource that is monopolized by the bourgeoisie and is the source of its power, and basically argued that in modern capitalist economies, it's more than just economic capital. It's also what he called cultural capital and social capital and other kinds of capital. and in particular, the ability to secure and ideally monopolize a scarce resource like education. And education in the new global economy, in the new post-industrial information-based global economy, education is the ultimate scarce resource, right? And we all know now that the returns to education are extremely high, but education is still a scarce resource, right? There's only so much overall education that can be generated. The value of a degree is dependent on how scarce that degree is. So those who can access education essentially have an interest in rationing education. So what we argued in that piece is, and the piece was on India itself, and then later on I've drawn these comparisons with Brazil, but especially sort of post-1980s, with the globalization of the economy, the increasing returns to technology and the information economy, et cetera, you do see the rise in the expansion of the middle class. Now, one of the problems with the term middle class is, what's the middle and what do we mean by class, right? And it does become a little bit tricky. So we don't mean literally the middle. We're more interested in class as a particular category of people that are able to mobilize particular forms of capital. And in this case, in particular, educational capital. And obviously, and even in the traditional sense of how we've defined the middle class, it's always been associated with professionalization, right? With securing credentials and then translating those credentials into economic opportunity. So in Brazil and in India, the new economy, the new information-based economy created opportunities for the expansion of the middle class, but the developmental state, the Nehruvian state and the modernizing state of both the authoritarian regimes in Brazil and later on the democratic regimes, the state played a huge role in developing education. Right? So until recently, private universities in India were completely absent and insignificant. And all the educational avenues were publicly provided and subsidized. And it was quite similar in Brazil. So like India, Brazil overinvested in universities and higher education, underinvested in primary education. And in effect, this was a massive subsidy to this aspiring middle class, right? And so this aspiring middle class takes advantage of these state subsidized educational opportunities. They get degrees, they do extremely well. They also migrate in large numbers to the US and Europe and elsewhere. And then eventually, of course, they're threatened from below when the PT comes to power in Brazil and introduces affirmative action in universities and puts a lot of money into primary and secondary education. And all of a sudden, the pool of people who want to get the higher credentials has expanded dramatically, and there's real competition now for the middle class. And likewise in India, the demand for reservations, the rise of the OBCs as a category that's claiming the reservations in educational institutions as well, increases the overall competition to get into the IITs, to get into the technical colleges, to get into universities. And eventually this is the basis for reaction, as I said earlier. The ideological point though, and others have made this argument, but the ideological point, of course, is that the middle class justifies itself on the basis of arguments about meritocracy, right? So it's not about property in the traditional sense of the capitalist class. It's about we merited our social position because we worked hard, because we're smart, because we have good discipline, etc. And if everyone would just be more like us, they too would be prosperous, right? So it is a universal ideology. Anybody can make it if they work hard enough. And obviously in the US, we're very familiar with this type of ideology. And there's of course some truth to it. I mean, one of the reasons that it elicits consent. That one of the reasons that it's a very compelling ideology is that some do indeed make it, right? Some who are not middle class, some who are lower caste or Black in Brazil or from low income groups occasionally do make it through the system, through various channels. Sometimes it's pure brilliance. Sometimes it's helped by quotas, etc. So there is some mobility in the system, but overall, of course, from a purely statistical point of view, it's clear that the dominant trend is this reproduction of the middle class and this rationing of access to public resources that have supported this class historically. And just when this class is really coming onto its own, really becoming dominant in popular culture and politics and media, and this ideology of meritocracy is really expanding, it's of course precisely at that moment that they start saying, maybe we should cut back on public education. Maybe we should hand this over to the private sector and neoliberalize. Maybe we shouldn't have so many avenues for the upward mobility of the lower castes and the lower classes, et cetera, right? And that's when there are challenges to this hegemony, which we see, across the board, various movements, pushing back, demanding an expansion of education, not the increasing privatization of education. But at least in the current moment, the middle class still is, of course, politically hegemonic, being, as I argued in the earlier segment, the real social base of the reactionary regimes that have come to power in Brazil and India.
Right. So, when we talk about class and the new middle class, we can also talk about cities, and your recent collaborative project actually looks at Delhi as a city and how it itself becomes a space that breeds inequality. Considering what has been happening in India in the recent years with regards to citizenship and issues of governance, how do you look at it in terms of the relationship between citizenship and these questions of class and governance in a city like Delhi?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought up the Cities of Delhi project, which I did in collaboration for the Center for Policy Research, and in particular, Partha Mukhopadhyay. And initially we started that project largely because we realized that the urban in India is understudied relative to the rural. There's lots of wonderful young scholars now, geographers, sociologists, anthropologists, sometimes political scientists who are studying urban settings, but it's a relatively new development. And the data in particular is not very good. And I've got another project with my colleague here at Brown, Ashutosh Varshni, and Siddharth Swaminathan, who's at Azim Premji in Bangalore, where we're doing survey work in 15 Indian cities. And what we're finding is, the traditional sources of data that people have relied on to make sense of aggregate trends in urban India, the NSS and the census, they're good and robust sources of data, but there's real problems, especially when it comes to having more fine-grained understandings of inequality. So we launched the Cities of Delhi project to do a lot of field work in different settlement types in Delhi and just try to get a better and more grounded understanding of how people access basic services. And what we ended up finding, and to people who know Delhi well, this isn't a surprise per se, but we thought important to carefully document this, that settlement to settlement, from JJCs to designated slums to unauthorized colonies to regularized unauthorized colonies to planned colonies, resettlement colonies. There's 8 different settlement categories in Delhi. It turns out that these different types of settlements essentially bake in highly differentiated forms of citizenship. That is, if you live in a nice planned colony like Vasant Vihar or House Khas, you're going to get the full spectrum of services. You barely have to ask for it. You barely have to pay for it. It just kind of comes. It's pretty good. Sure, there's a few power cuts here and there, but by and large, you get your water and the streets don't flood that much, and sanitation works. And then as you move down the hierarchy of settlement types, you get less and less and less, all the way to JJCs, where you get almost nothing. Tanker truck water at best, maybe a community toilet. And you know, on the one hand, this is basically a kind of apartheid. You know, in my previous work, I studied South Africa and South African cities and service delivery in the aftermath of apartheid. And you know, the apartheid state officially differentiated citizenship, right? So whites had everything, blacks had nothing, and then in between you had categories, and they had to live in. So Indian urban apartheid is not racialized per se. It's not based on caste, although of course it's highly correlated with caste and community. But for all intents and purposes, the 8 different settlement types are 8 different levels of citizenship, right? The higher up you are in the hierarchy of settlement types, the more you are enfranchised, entitled as a citizen to basic services. And the lower down in the hierarchy, all the way down to the JJCs, the less you are entitled to as a citizen, right? And this raises a whole host of questions. But I think one of the key ones is simply the recognition that, especially in contemporary capitalism and especially in the urban context, one of the key drivers, one of the key mechanisms through which inequality is being reproduced is not the workplace, is not income distribution. Obviously, those things still matter. They're incredibly important. And they're what sociologists have historically focused on, as well as economists, of course. But one of the key sources of inequality today is space, is what neighborhood you live in. And living in different neighborhoods means you have access to a different bundle of services and opportunities. And there's a huge literature in the United States by sociologists and economists that has basically shown that the #1 predictor of your long-term well-being is not your education. Well, of course, education matters. Of course, income matters. But a huge predictor of your long-term well-being is the neighborhood you live in, the neighborhood in which you develop your cultural capital and your social capital, the neighborhood in which you access educational opportunities, and in India, even basic things like water and sanitation. So the city itself, and this is, we're all of sociology, all of modernization theory, and even Ambedkar, celebrated the city as this space of emancipation. As people moved to cities, caste wouldn't matter as much, religion wouldn't matter as much. Everyone could be an individual and pursue opportunities. Once you get to the city, you have opportunities, and it's just about seizing those opportunities. Well, it turns out that cities are really, really good at rationing opportunity, that the incumbents, that those who were there first, as it were, are really good at making sure that those opportunities, largely benefit them, and to make the most of those opportunities, whether it's housing or access to educational institutions or being able to live in the nice neighborhoods that have a lot of greenery and parks, et cetera, et cetera. You make sure others, new claimants on the city, can't claim those same opportunities, right? And this is actually an old argument. Max Weber made this argument about medieval European cities. Medieval European cities invented the concept of citizen, but only some were citizens, right? Those with property were citizens, and the other classes were not citizens and didn't have the same rights. And I think in many ways, modern cities, and this is not just an Indian phenomenon, obviously this is true in Brazil, it's true in the United States, with the legacy of with the effects of racism and racial segregation and the persistence of ghettos. The cities in the US are also highly differentiated, including, of course, how the police treat different communities, right? So there's more and more work in sociology on thinking about the city as this kind of space that in and of itself produces a tremendous amount of inequality. Now, that's not always true. Some cities do better in terms of being more inclusive and having policies that do allow for new migrants to integrate and to have access to the opportunities offered by cities. But by and large, what we're finding in our research and what we found in the Cities of Delhi project is that the inequality is actually quite extreme, and it's literally baked in to the spatial distribution of services and hence larger opportunities.
Right. So my next question is sort of connected to this. In one of your recent articles, you've written about democratic deepening. So if you could tell us, what does this mean? What is democratic deepening? And then how do you propose to use this to understand the state and civil society relations in India?
Yeah, so my definition of democratic deepening just builds on the existing literature, and there's really, so the point of departure, of course, is that first and foremost you want democracy in the formal sense of the term, and that's the right to vote, associational freedoms, the freedom to due process, etc., individual liberties. And by that definition, India and Brazil are democratic. Of course, there's many efforts to measure these things and to put them on a spectrum, et cetera. But there are elections in India and Brazil and in South Africa, which was the other case that I was looking at in that piece. And by and large, individual liberties and basic rights of association and media are protected. Now, they're being challenged in the current moment, and it's a serious moment of crisis and of real democratic erosion and backsliding. But I want to set that apart and just say, up until the Modi regime coming to power, up until Bolsonaro coming to power, India and Brazil, by any definition, were, quote, consolidated democracies, all right, and where there was every expectation that governments would be elected and there would be competition, et cetera, and the ability of the opposition to mobilize was guaranteed by law, et cetera. And, so all those good things were there. But that sort of raises, two questions. On a day-to-day basis, do all citizens enjoy full rights of citizenship? It's one thing to have the rights. They're in the Constitution and the courts uphold them. It's another thing to actually be able to use your rights, to access your rights, to translate your civic and political rights, for example, into social rights. So, the courts in India and in Brazil have said you have a right to basic services, you have a right to water. Now in India, you have a right to food. You even have a right to employment in rural areas. That's great. Social rights have been legislated, but can you actually access those things, right? So in other words, it's great that you can vote every 4 years or whatever it is. It's great that you have civic and political rights, but can you translate those rights into what I've called effective citizenship? And so that larger process is what we mean by deepening democracy. And there's really two axes here. So, one is actual participation in the democratic process. And I don't mean, again, just voting. I also mean between elections on a day-to-day basis, but also even in organizing for elections, can all social groups organize equally? Can women participate as equally as men? Can Dalits participate as equally as upper caste? Can Blacks participate as much as whites in the Brazilian context? Can they all equally overcome their collective action problems? And obviously, there's no democracy in the world where that's true, right? But there's obviously a spectrum of, only elites or dominant groups are able to effectively participate and organize in political society, to, large chunks of society can actually do it, right? It's obviously never going to be perfect. There's always power, there's always impediments, but we can make it more participatory. And in the electoral realm, India is actually really good. India is one of the few democracies in the world where, at least, in most election cycles, lower castes vote more than upper castes, women vote more than men, Muslims vote in pretty high numbers, generally speaking. It's less clear whether the political parties that are out there actually represent their interests, right? And, that's changed in the last 2 decades with regional and lower caste parties, coming into the political realm. But it's still, and Christophe Jaffrolet and his associates have demonstrated time and time again that the actual, political representatives still tend to be overwhelmingly male, even more so if it weren't for the reservation systems, overwhelmingly upper caste and upper class, so there's still a bias of representation, as it were. And then again, as I said, between elections, is everyone equally associating, lobbying, organizing, joining unions, or is it just some dominant groups that dominate the associational, the civil society practices of that democracy? So that's the participation continuum. And so when we think about democratic deepening, first and foremost, we're thinking about who participates, on what terms, and to what effect. The second dimension is not about participation, but it's about what is subject to democratic authorization. So there's only parts of modern societies that are democratic. The economy, by and large, is not democratic. Now, there's some macroeconomic management of the economy that is subject to democratic authorization because it's done by the government, and the government in principle answers to a parliament and the people, et cetera. But of course, as you have a spectrum. In very neoliberal societies like the US and the UK, the policy arenas over which government has control and those policy arenas as such are subject to democratic authorization is actually quite limited. And then you have the social democracies in, say, Northern Europe, where the reach of public decision-making and public and democratic authorization is much deeper and much wider, right? So education, childcare, the entire welfare state apparatus, all of that has been, in effect, decommodified, that is taken out of the marketplace, which is driven by property and accumulated resources, and put into the public domain where it's subject to democratic authorization. So deepening has in effect two axes. One is the degree and depth and quality of participation in the political process and in civil society. And the other dimension is just the range of policy areas or arenas over which elected representatives representing the people have actual authority to do things. And in the neoliberal era, this has become the huge problem because more and more decisions that affect people broadly have been taken out of the public realm and in effect privatized, right? And we're seeing this in education, we're seeing it in urban services. Neoliberalization is in effect undoing some forms of democratic deepening. So that's generally how I define it. And then in the paper you made reference to, I simply make the point that across the three democracies I was looking at, Brazil, South Africa, and India, which have a lot in common because they democratized, they're post-colonial democracies, they democratized against the backdrops of extraordinary inequality, income inequality, but also racial inequality in Brazil and South Africa, caste inequality, and community-based inequality in India. And so the point of the paper was try and assess the degree to which since becoming consolidated democracies, they've been able to move the needle in terms of democratic deepening. And, to make a very long story short, Brazil's had quite a bit of success, at least until Bolsonaro came to power. South Africa sort of in the middle, and I argue, in India, democratic deepening has been a much bigger challenge. Having said that, with India, you always have to disaggregate and remind people that India isn't really one democracy, it's multiple democracies, and there's a huge difference between the Keralas and the Tamil Nadus of the world and the Bihars and the UPs. And so even within India, we see some very successful cases of democratic deepening. Kerala and Tamil Nadu would be the best examples, and other cases where democratic deepening has clearly not progressed as much as one might have hoped for after 70 years of consolidated democracy.
Right. Yeah. In India, we do have, I guess, different democracies. If we, take examples of the different states. Now, these three countries that you've studied, Brazil, India, and South Africa, in your study, you've shown how the working class mobilizations have driven political transformations and also led to democratization. So, could you elaborate on how this can be translated into sustainable transformative capacity?
Yeah, so I mean, the working class plays a key role, but I think it comes with a number of qualifications. So there's a huge literature in comparative sociology on the role of the working class in supporting and sustaining and deepening democracy. Ruschmeyer, Stevens, and Huber wrote the famous book making this argument and actually showing that the quality of democracy, democratic deepening, is highly correlated with the strength and the degree of mobilization of the working class. And there's no doubt within India that hypothesis is confirmed by cases like Kerala, where it's half a century of working class mobilization that has helped drive the so-called Kerala model, a term I actually don't like because it's not a model, it's a regime. It's a left of center, I like to say social democratic. Many people in Kerala get upset when I say social democratic because they want to call it something else. But in any event, it's definitely a form of democratic deepening. Broad-based participation across segments in civil society, in political society, lots of competition, everybody's mobilized, everybody's organized, and real substantive results, land reform, expansion of the welfare state, et cetera. And there's no doubt in Kerala, I mean, there's competing arguments about what has driven the success of the Kerala story, but sustained subordinate class mobilization has been the key. So it's not just your traditional manufacturing working class, which is actually a pretty small percentage of the working population in Kerala, and for that matter in India. A lot of it was, agricultural laborers and small farmers, and then of course workers in the informal sector who are obviously working class, but the term working class is a bit tricky because at least in the traditional comparative literature, when we say working class, we mean industrial workers in the manufacturing sector, formal sector, which we know in India is a tiny percentage of the overall labor force. And in a sense, that's become the dilemma. That is, the traditional pathway to making democracy more robust was indeed, predicated on the existence of a relatively, broad, numerous, and quite homogenous working class, right? And again, the image is industrial workers in Europe, right? At one point, where 30 to 40% of the population, they're all unionized. They all work in big factories, et cetera. So lots of homogenization, and it's Europe at the time, which had hardly any ethnic or racial diversity. When we're talking about democracies of the global South, there's two problems, all right? So the working class just is not that big social category it used to be. India's been deindustrializing since 2001. So there's fewer and fewer jobs in manufacturing and more jobs in the service sectors, et cetera. It's the same in Brazil. It's the same in South Africa. Moreover, those class categories have multiple other identities, religion, race, caste, regionalism, language. So that homogeneity of the working class that is almost taken for granted in the comparative literature on European democracy is non-existent in the global South. And that's increasingly true in the North as well. There's other sources of identity and identification that have emerged. And so, waiting for the working class at this point is a bit like waiting for Godot. I mean, it sounds wonderful, and as sociologists, we want the subordinate classes to be effectively represented and empowered in democratic regimes. But that process of, quote, class formation, to come back to Gramsci, has become increasingly difficult, at least in the traditional sense of the term, for subordinate groups. And so I think it's become increasingly important, if we're interested in understanding the circumstances under which democracies would deepen and serve the cause of justice and inclusion and maximizing welfare and opportunity for all. We need to get beyond these sort of traditional categories that are problematic and think a little bit differently. And I think the way to think differently about it is to think in terms of civil society. Now, you know, in India, this is a sort of contentious concept. It's contentious everywhere, but it's especially contentious in India, and for good reason. You know, I think Chatterjee was right to draw this famous distinction, Partha Chatterjee, between political and civil society. I think he overdid the distinction a little. So in his definition, you know, political society is where the subaltern classes get something, you know, through the electoral politics and basically patronage. But the middle class, the elites, use civil society. They're the ones who can use their rights effectively. And there's no doubt there's a lot of truth to that, that, you know, the middle class in India is particularly good at using its rights. On the other hand, subordinate groups have been really good at we're back.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. There was a power cut in my Wi-Fi.
Yeah. No, I totally understand. No worries.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how far to rewind, but I was saying that the debate, I think, has shifted from just focusing on the working class and class formation to thinking more about the conditions under which, you know, civil society itself becomes democratizing. And let's be clear, civil society is not always democratizing. Civil society can be dominated by the RSS in India or the KKK in the US. But it is a space in which subalterns can mobilize, right? And one of the important things about democracy, even when it's not working very well, even when it's not translating civic rights into social rights, at least it creates these spaces of potential mobilization. And it's very uneven in India. Some parts, there's been a lot of mobilization, others less. From decade to decade, it shifts. But there's real potential when groups like the MKSS come together and they bring together, you know, small farmers and landless laborers and informal sector workers, but they mobilize them around making their rights more effective, demanding transparency, demanding accountability, demanding that public budgets be, you know, spent on things that actually enhance social opportunity and not eaten away by corruption or cronyism, et cetera. So there's, you know, whether it's women's groups, whether it's the LGBTQ community, whether it's Adivasis or Dalits, other marginalized communities, including, of course, large segments of the so-called working class, increasingly, I think they have been able to claim those rights and mobilize around those rights, including the protests against the CAA, which was a real cross-section of civil society, you know, students, Muslim groups, Dalit groups, et cetera, all in the name of the Constitution, reclaiming the multicultural and secular and rule of law ideals of the Constitution. So I think we need to think more about not so much just actors, but the actual spaces in which a range of different actors who are not as structurally homogenous as the traditional working class was, but still have the potential to combine and organize around a shared sense of, you know, solidarity and claiming rights and making their rights more effective. But I think, you know, it's a lot of work and it's complicated, and we have to be careful not to assume that civil society sort of automatically, you know, produces this progressive coalition, much like we used to automatically think that capitalism would produce a revolutionary working class.
Right. Thank you so much for the engaging answer. So the last question, I know we have taken up a lot of time. In one of your recent books, you look at the relationship between deliberative democracy and development studies, something that often gets ignored. And, you've also correctly pointed it out. So do you think an understanding of the two together can help us in democratic transitioning?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason we care about democracy, or the reason we should care about democracy, is that it enhances the probability that we make decisions as a society, not through power, not through majoritarianism, not through manipulation or superior organizational capacity, but through deliberation. Now, the minute you start making an argument like this, people call you naive and it's silly, and this is only what a bunch of academics at Brown or JNU could possibly sit around and theorize. And I did this book this is with Vijayendra Rao, who's an economist at the World Bank, and it's an edited volume. Arjuna Padarai, Jane Mansbridge, Peter Evans, a bunch of other sociologists and anthropologists contributed as well. And one of the things we were trying to do is to say, so pure deliberation obviously is incredibly difficult. And again, it's a regulative ideal. It'll never exist in the absolute sense of the term. But to the extent that we can move decision-making towards deliberation and away from just majority rule or bargaining or the other ways in which historically complex societies have made decisions, the better off we're going to be. And really, this goes back to very old ideas about democracy, but nicely summarized in Amartya Sen's work and the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas. And it really comes down to this, what is development? Well, no one gets to say what development is. Development is complicated. And I'm not talking just about, quote, developing societies. Any society trying to make decisions about the future, about where to invest scarce resources, about whether to promote growth or sustainability or promote inclusion and equality. These are tough decisions. There's no formula. The World Bank and the good governance people and neoliberals and many economists would tell you they have the formula, right? The truth is, these are ethical decisions. Fundamentally, these are societal decisions. And no one has a monopoly. No one has an answer on what those decisions should be. What we do need is procedures that maximize the possibility and the probability that the ultimate decision emerges, again, not out of technocratic fiat, not out of market forces, not out of dominant group power politics, but out of a process of public deliberation. And the only institution or the only way of organizing our political life that we know of that actually promotes the ideal of deliberation is, of course, democracy. Now, having said that, we know that elections are full of money and powerful interests and manipulation. We know that once politicians come to power, oftentimes they're less about representing the people and engaging in real deliberation in the Lok Sabha than they are about, fattening their own politics and getting ready for the next, their own pockets and getting ready for the next election. Which is why promoting deliberation is really complicated. You want to think about new modes of participation. You want to think in particular about the scale at which decisions are being made. One of the huge problems in India, of course, and I think Arjuna Padarai summarized this beautifully when he talked about the urban poor in Mumbai. He said they are citizens without a city. That is, they can vote in the Maharashtra elections, they can vote in the national elections, but when it comes to actually having some power over the city of Mumbai, they have very little power because cities themselves have very little power. And it's the same with villages throughout India. And so I think decentralization in the sense of giving real authority and power and democratic authorization to local entities is key. And it can then promote spaces in which and this, when we talk about deliberation, we don't necessarily mean every citizen showing up and constantly deliberating. All right, this is, I think it was George Orwell who once said, the reason socialism will never work is there are too many meetings. Now, I don't think meetings are necessarily a bad thing, but of course we can't be meeting all the time. Having said that, if you have a very vibrant civil society with a lot of associations that represent the full spectrum of the population, and in particular can represent marginalized groups or subordinate groups, and you can have a lot of deliberative spaces where decision-making is not monopolized by politicians, the powerful, or the bureaucrats, but actually is subject to real, open, transparent public deliberation, you can make much better decisions, right? And the decisions are not only better in that they're closer to actually reflecting the inputs of ordinary citizens and civil society organizations, they're probably much better because there's more legitimacy, there's more buy-in, there's more commitment. I mean, all democratic regimes, more than anything else, need legitimacy. And there's no better way to generate genuine legitimacy than by promoting deliberation, real deliberations, right? So again, it's a regulative ideal. It's hard to achieve, and yet across the world, whether we're looking at participatory budgeting in Brazil, whether we're looking at the whole range of experiments in civil society organizations and decentralization across the world, but sometimes really more in the global South than anywhere else, where there's a lot of innovation and experimentation. And we have seen, instances where it was possible to design institutions that actually did increase the degree of deliberation and the extent to which deliberation, as opposed to some other mechanism, money, power, majoritarianism, is actually what drove the final decision. And this includes just large deliberations in the public sphere. And I would just give two very broad examples, but I think they really do support this point about public deliberation. We face an existential crisis with climate change across the world, with the exception of the United States, which is not particularly deliberative. Across the world, people more or less now accept the science of climate change. Now, we're a long ways from having actual mechanisms and political solutions to addressing the climate change problem, but the science is not only robust, but the degree to which the science has shaped public opinion is very powerful. Right, and it goes without saying that we're not going to do anything about climate change until we actually have a deliberated consensus about what needs to be done, right? There's another parallel, and I think that's on gender issues. Again, there's a long ways to go. But in the last half century, in terms of public opinion on issues of gender, there's been a dramatic shift, and that creates spaces where gender issues can be mobilized and debated publicly, and there's been some progress. So in a sense, all social change really does begin with the kind of public deliberation that happens first in counterpublics, it's small local spaces of subordinate groups, and then under the right circumstances can become part of a larger public conversation and even get translated into political action. And so, we need to learn from these successful, localized, innovative experiments in deliberation and think harder about how deliberation isn't just something we do in universities. It's a societal phenomenon. Sometimes universities are autocratic. Sometimes, of course, the ideal is that they're meant to be deliberative. I think that's just as true of your local Gram Sabha or your sectoral health council in Brazil or your popular budgeting process in South Africa.
Right. Thank you, Professor Heller, for the engaging conversation. I hope our viewers, particularly the young ones, go back and take an interest in all the concepts that you've taken the time and pain to explain with examples. For instance, something like even hegemony, which, like you rightly said, gets thrown out a lot, but there's a need to go deeper into the meanings. Thank you once again.
Yeah, Rituparna and Deepali, thank you so much for organizing this. I think it's a wonderful initiative, and I hope people tune in and listen to all the interviews you've been doing, and thank you so much for your efforts. This is really fantastic.
Thank you